Hey guys, what's up? My name is Zach, and today we're going to be doing a 2020 election prediction between Pete Buttigieg and Donald Trump. So, Pete Buttigieg, I hope I'm pronouncing his last name right. He's the mayor of South Bend, Indiana. He's been in that position since about 2012. He's one of the youngest mayors in the United States, I believe in the top 3 at the age of 36, and let's just get right into it. Overall, I think that Pete Buttigieg would be a fairly decent candidate for the Democrats to run. I don't think he'd be the best, mostly because of his lack of name recognition and his lack of experience overall. He has made some bids for treasurer of Indiana and for chair of the DNC, I believe, but he's been unsuccessful in those attempts. I think he'd have more luck in pursuing something first before running for president, but regardless, he's been listed as a potential 2020 contender given his popularity as being a young and millennial mayor. He also served as a lieutenant during the war in Afghanistan. So let's get right into safe, likely leaning toss-up states. Texas I consider to be safe in Trump's column, and same with Georgia. I don't see Pete Buttigieg having much appeal to states like Texas and Georgia, mostly because you do need... Oh, and one more important detail about Pete Buttigieg is he is openly gay, and he'd be the first openly gay president, obviously, if he were to run for the presidency and win. He'd be the first openly gay candidate, period, to run on a major party's ticket. So that's one big detail, but he does not have good minority appeal, and he certainly doesn't have good appeal to states like Texas and Georgia, being from a state like Indiana. And with that said, I would not consider these 2 states to have a single chance of going in Pete Buttigieg's column, mostly because of his lack of name recognition, which will be a big disadvantage for him if he were to be the Democrats' candidate. His home state of Indiana considered to be likely in Trump's column, and this comes down to the fact that even though Trump does have a low approval in the state, I believe it's at +5 or +4, which isn't low. It's above 50%, but that's still, for a state like Indiana, that's still pretty low. However, if Mike Pence is on the ticket for Trump's re-election in 2020, this state's going to go solidly in his column, or at least it should, which is why I've been feeling it solid in pretty much any other Trump election prediction. However, Pete Buttigieg is from the state, and considering his home state advantage along with Pence's, I'd list it just likely in Trump's column rather than solid, which is what it would be if there wasn't any home state advantage for Pete Buttigieg. Virginia I consider to be likely in Pete Buttigieg's column. He would do very well in a state like Virginia, considering that he is openly gay, and this is a very solidly Democratic state, so I consider it to be likely in his column. New Hampshire I consider to be likely in Pete Buttigieg's column as well. We're seeing this state trend more towards the Democrats overall, and I think that in one more election cycle, it won't even be considered a flip state at all. It'll be considered just solidly in the Democrats' column, just because of how it's trending, and considering that I think the only reason why the Democrats didn't do well in 2016, both in the Senate and well, I shouldn't say that, because they did win the Senate seat here very narrowly, and the President and Hillary Clinton did win here very narrowly, but they didn't do as well as they should have. However, I see a very strong trend in this state, especially when looking at Donald Trump's approval here, and the Republicans' approval in the state overall. I consider it to be more closer, safe Democrat than it is toss-up. That's just my opinion. Maine's 2 electoral votes I consider to be likely in Pete Buttigieg's column for virtually the same reasons. Virginia, state's trending more Democratic overall, and it's very unlikely for it to go red for most Democratic candidates, I'd say. New Mexico I consider likely in Pete Buttigieg's column. I think that this state will be a bit harder to win in compared to other Democrats, considering that he will not have a tremendous amount of southwestern appeal, which we'll begin to see as I go through the video. But however, the state does have a solid Democratic identity, and I can see it going for Pete Buttigieg, who is a pretty decent candidate. Same with Colorado, same logic around it. Solid Democratic base. It's trending Democratic overall, away from it being what some would consider to be a swing state. I don't think many people consider Colorado to be a swing state anymore. It's pretty solidly in the Democrats' column, and for that reason I call it likely in Pete Buttigieg's column as well. North Carolina I'd call likely in Trump's column. I don't see Pete Buttigieg having tremendous southern appeal. For North Carolina, I don't see him doing very well in. I don't think he can pull over a significant number of moderate Republicans to his side. He could turn out the Democratic base here pretty well, but that isn't huge. In order to win North Carolina, like I've said before, you need to have African-American appeal, and you need to pull over those moderate Republicans who have a strong disapproval of Trump, and I don't think Pete Buttigieg could do that, making it go likely in Trump's column. Minnesota considered to be likely in Pete Buttigieg's column. Some might argue that Pete Buttigieg will have strong Rust Belt appeal. However, when you're comparing him to someone like Amy Klobuchar, who I just did a video about yesterday, Amy Klobuchar is much more well-known. She's much more of a familiar face around the Rust Belt, especially in her home state of Minnesota, in which she is the fifth most popular senator, I think, in the United States in terms of approval. Pete Buttigieg, however, does not have the name recognition and the experience, I think, to do significantly well in the Rust Belt. I think he would do better in the Rust Belt compared to some Democrats, but maybe not tremendously well, considering that he is technically from the Rust Belt, being from Indiana. But still, I think his lack of name recognition would probably make the Rust Belt a bit more competitive than it should be for him. Arizona, considerably likely in Trump's column. As I said before, I don't see Buttigieg doing tremendously well in the Southwest. And I certainly don't see him doing tremendously well in a state like Arizona, where you need to have Hispanic appeal and some moderate Republican appeal. And I don't think that Pete Buttigieg has either of those things. I think that he would. I don't think he would do tremendously well in a state like Arizona in a statewide race. And I realize that Trump does have zero approval here, but when it comes down to it, the moderate Republicans are going to vote for Trump if the Democrat doesn't approve it does not appeal to them very much, and I don't think Pete Buttigieg would appeal very well to those moderate Republicans, so therefore I consider to be likely in Trump's column. Now let's go to the leaning states. Michigan, I consider a lean in Pete Buttigieg's column. Like I said before, his lack of name recognition would not do very well for him. Although he is from the region, Trump definitely does have a larger name recognition than someone like Pete Buttigieg does, and I can see that making the state competitive in that case. I think that in the end he'll win it, because when it comes down to it, I think that he's from Indiana and he can appeal to Democrats in Michigan the same way he can appeal to Democrats in Indiana through blue-collar appeal and through white working class appeal in general. I call it a lean in this column. Florida, this is kind of early to call, but I call it leaning in Trump's column. The reason why I'm calling this state so early is because, one, Trump does have a solid approval in this state. I believe it's +4, which for a swing state, like I said before, is very good. Pete Buttigieg would not have great appeal amongst the South in general, which is why I didn't fill Georgia in as likely, and which is why I'm filling North Carolina in as likely in the case of Pete Buttigieg. I don't think that Pete Buttigieg would do very well in the South at all, just because he doesn't have African-American appeal, nor does he have Hispanic appeal, and he would not be able to turn out a significant number of moderate Republicans to his side, making Florida, which I would already call in Trump's column for almost any other Democrat, in Trump's column here as well. Maine second, I would call leaning in Trump's column. I think that Pete Buttigieg could appeal to a number of voters up here, but it's still solidly in Trump's pocket, so for that reason I'd call it leaning in Trump's column. Pennsylvania, I would call leaning in Pete Buttigieg's column, virtually for the same reason I call it leaning. I called Michigan leaning in his column, because he'll be able to appeal to a number of blue-collar workers here. However, he does not have a good amount of name recognition, and Trump could monopolize on that. And one thing's for certain is that Pete Buttigieg would get demolished in debates with Trump. I don't see him. If you guys have seen him speak on the news, I don't see him doing very good in a debate against Trump, where he would ridicule his candidates. And if any of you have watched Trump go up against Jeb Bush, you know what I'm referring to. I guarantee he would pull that same kind of stuff with Pete Buttigieg, and I don't see Pete Buttigieg being able to defend himself very well. That's going to be a very big factor in 2020 as well, is picking a candidate who can defend themselves well without looking like a moron during a debate with Trump is going to be a big factor as well, because I think that was a big factor in the 2016 election, because Hillary Clinton, I think, did decently against Trump in debates. However, Trump was able to appeal to his base even more through those debates, and especially through the Republican debates. I think that the Republican debates, Trump absolutely demolished him, because no Republican was used to that kind of politics, and he caught him completely off guard. Hillary kind of adapted to it, but even then she didn't do very well either. And I think that the Democrats will have to look out for that in 2020, and I don't think that Pete Buttigieg is the candidate to have a good debate with Trump in. I just thought I'd cover that. I didn't mean to go off on a tangent. My apologies. Nebraska's second, I'd call leaning in Pete Buttigieg's column, and this comes down to the fact that he does have he's from South Bend, Indiana, and South Bend is over here in this northern part of Indiana. I think that if he can appeal to people in there, he can definitely appeal to people in Omaha, which already has a low approval of Trump, and I think he can monopolize on that, and his appeal to people in the Midwest, I think, could actually be a factor as well, which would make this district go leaning in his column. Nevada, I'd call a lean in Pete Buttigieg's column. I think that this state will be very much at risk, but Trump does have a very low approval in this state, which has been fluctuating very much throughout the course of this past year. But still, currently, it does hold a solid minus, I think, like 10 or 12 approval of Trump, which is not good for Trump. And despite Pete Buttigieg's low Hispanic appeal, I think that he could drive for the Democratic base and take advantage of Trump's low approval in the state, making it go leaning in his column. Okay, so now Pete Buttigieg has 269 electoral votes, making him one away from the presidency. Wisconsin, I would call leaning in Pete Buttigieg's column. That's kind of a hard call to make, and this makes him the hypothetical next president of the United States. This state does have a very low approval of Trump, even lower than Michigan, as I've said before. And that's been pretty consistent throughout this past year. And I think that Pete Buttigieg will appeal to a number of people in this state, given the fact that he is from Indiana, and given the fact that people from Indiana hold many of the same values that people in Wisconsin do. He would be able to appeal very well to the blue-collar workers, the Democratic base in the state, white, working class, in the suburbs. He can appeal very well to. And for that reason, I call the state leaning in his column. I think, like I said in the past, I think his lack of name recognition will be a very big obstacle for him to overcome. But in the end, his values, I think, will appeal to Wisconsin over Trump, and Trump's low approval in the state would also be the death of him, I think, in Wisconsin come 2020. So I call it leaning in Pete Buttigieg's column. Okay, now down to Ohio and Wisconsin. I would call Ohio leaning in Trump's column. And I know this state does have a low approval of Trump, and I know that many people are saying that if he's going to win in states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, he might win. He's going to win in Ohio. But Ohio has had a very down-the-middle approval of Trump. It's been pretty much 50-50 split throughout the course of the year. And I think that Pete Buttigieg's lack of name recognition will be a big factor in the state, and Trump's strong base in the state overall, I think, will turn out for him, just like they did in 2016. And I know I hate to bring up the polls of 2016, but the 2016 polls did pretty consistently show Hillary Clinton leading by a very slim margin in this state. And in the end, this state went to Trump by a pretty solid, 2-point margin, I believe. And I can see that easily happening in 2020 as well. I think there's a number of Trump Republicans who just don't respond to the polls and who are maybe even lie in the polls, and I think that was a factor, especially in Ohio in 2020. And I think that Trump does have a pretty solid base in the state, and I think that'll turn out for him in 2020 as well, making it go leaning in his column. And last, Iowa, which I consider to be the hardest state to call. I would call leaning in Pete Buttigieg's column, and this mainly comes down to Trump's very low approval in this state, which is surprisingly low for a state he won by fairly solid margins, and Pete Buttigieg's pretty strong approval amongst blue-collar workers, which is a big factor in the state, which I think he can definitely have. His lack of name recognition, however, will be a big obstacle, especially in Iowa. But in the end, I think that he can overcome it, and combined with Trump's low approval, I think he can win in Iowa. So overall, this is my election prediction. There is a number of ways for Trump to win in this election. I think that Pete Buttigieg is a very risky candidate for the Democrats to run if that's who they choose. He can very easily win states like Wisconsin and Iowa, maybe Nevada in that case. Trump wins, and I can also see a number of factors in which Pete Buttigieg, in which this election becomes 269 to 269 split, and the House of Representatives has to decide. I can see that being a big factor as well, and especially in an election this close. But overall, I don't think he'd be the best candidate, but that's the electoral map. If you guys enjoyed the video, you can please comment down below, like and subscribe, share with your friends. You know, for small channels like mine to grow. If you have any suggestions of your own, please leave them down below, and I'll put them on my list for another video in the future. Hope you guys enjoyed. Have a good day. See ya.